Cosmic here, welcome back to the channel, and today it's a little bit of story time. So, as you may know if you follow me on Twitter, I attended the Michigan Grand Archive Regionals this past weekend and made top 8. Which was crazy, to say the least, considering I've only been playing a month. But I figured before I get into some story time, I want to talk about, well, what does regionals even mean? Because if you're not playing Grand Archive already, this is going to mean something completely different compared to every other trading card game out there. So I want to at least provide some context. There's a very huge reprint news, which, as you know, I've been hammering home about how accessibility needs to be improved upon, and the devs did answer that. And then, of course, I'll talk a little bit about the meta and kind of my thoughts on it, as well as my Swiss rounds and how they went. But first and foremost, I have to give the biggest shout out to True Champion Gaming. They were effectively the TOs and head judges for this event, even if it was based out of Upkeep Ann Arbor, which, as some of you know, is one of my home stores and one of the stores that I go to and partner with and do demos for and other stuff. But it was a great location to see so many people come out. We had either 47 or 48. I forget it off the top of my head, but it was just an absolute blast to play. So, you know, before I get into the card itself, they had a bunch of cool giveaways. There's all these like really sweet water bottles that I've seen, like Arasana, that if you know me, I just really like clerics or healers or mages in type of game. So I really love to see this level of branding. And then, of course, you might want to know what the actual prize looks like. It's this cute little box. And then it has the card inside itself, which I tried like a test of getting this on camera, but you can see there it says North American National Qualifier. Whoop, I almost got it there. And what's interesting is for these cards individually, it is a point-based system to play in Nats, and each one of these is worth 3, I think. You need 12 points total, and you also get points based on, you know, the events you play in, how long you've been playing the game, stuff like that. So there was a nice link on Luxera's map, which is a website that we're going to be using to talk about more of the meta. I'll leave a link to that down below if you are more interested in Grand Archive and maybe want to learn a little bit more about it, but definitely go read that article and do a much better job kind of explaining everything than I would do so here. But we also got a playmat for entering. We got these Sapphire packs, which were super fun to open. But again, let me circle back to what is a regional, right? So if you're coming from the trading card games, you might think regional, you might think, oh, massive event leads into like a pro tour or something even bigger, or direct invites to Nats, things of that nature, right? Not quite. These are somewhere between like a store championship level event for some games, and then not quite at the same level as like the ProQuest invites for Flesh and Blood. It's kind of in that middle ground where it is a higher tier event, or like I would say mid-tier event in terms of like people traveling for it and prizing overall, things of that nature, which if you do well in quite a few of them, then you will get your invite to Nationals. So it's a couple extra steps to kind of get there, but it is going to be kind of the premier event. A lot of people, if they just can't really extend past their locals, will likely end up going to if they can't make it to an Ascent, which an Ascent is a regional in other trading card game terms. And then, of course, there's Nats and then Worlds as well. So with regionals, again, you get a playmat for entering. I'll have some other images I'll showcase here. The Sapphire packs, which I was all in on the Gamba, just open them up right away, are really cool. So these are event-exclusive foils, not unique cards, but just the foiling version is exclusive to these events. And they're really fun to open because you can either, you know, oh, dang it, and miss and hit like a $10 foil, or there's like a current bid up for the Spirit of Slime, which is one of the key parts of the game and something that a lot of people who are playing Sylvia are going to want. It's probably going to go for $300 to $400, and that's just for participation. Now, yes, technically, there's only 150 of that card specifically in the world, and it is a bit of RNG, but hey, it's always nice to just get a little extra Gamba in your day when you're signing up for these events. And then, of course, for top 8, we actually got 2 extra Sapphire packs, some Mercurial Heart gold packs and silver packs, which you get for attending locals and things like that. And then, of course, also a top 8 playmat, which is, again, has the alchemist feel to it. Hide in the bush. I love the artwork. I'm still not sure which playmat I'm going to use for Grand Archive, because if you know me, I try to have a playmat for every card game that I'm playing. Like to stay on brand where I can. So I'm currently on the hunt for a Grand Archive playmat. So if you know one that I might like, let me know in the comments below, and I'll try to hunt it down and see what we can do. There was a really sweet giveaway for a Spirit of Water one that was just really, really great. So that's kind of the last thing I want to go back to at kind of a high level, is just the ultimately is the giveaways. Now, the event itself was 6 rounds, and I didn't get out of there until 8 hours after. There was a little bit of, going into overtime between rounds, making sure that people had time to run to the bathroom or step outside if they just needed a breather, things like that. So it's always understandable that there's going to be about 10 minutes of what we call admin time between rounds. So naturally, that should add on about an hour to the event anyways. And then when you're doing the giveaways and trying to do top 8s and photos, and obviously I was trying to catch some people on the way out, and I was beyond exhausted by that point, just because of how my event went. But it was still really cool to see so many people come out. We had people from, it was Wisconsin. I know there's some people from Ohio. There was a crew that flew up from Florida because they work for an airlines and super cheap flights. Maybe I'm going to go down to the Florida regional if I can. But really, and also Canada. I should also give a shout out to Canada because I'm probably going to go to the Canada regional in 3 weeks, I think is when it is. I forget how far it is now out, but I got to start planning for that soon. And it's just great to see a community kind of come together and celebrate a game like Grand Archive. Again, in these events, we had 47 players overall. It was a great time, and I think that the meta was a super interesting one. So why not? Let's go ahead and talk about it in a little bit of detail and talk about our Swiss run as well. So up front, we have the Luxera's map website. Yes, you can see my little face there in the background. But a couple things I want to get to before we dig into the Swiss and the other, the event itself in more detail, or also the meta report. But I want to give a huge shout out to the statement that Weaves of the Shore released. And my DMs blew up after this happened. Like, all right, I'm not going to say I started a canon event, but I'm just going to say the timing of this is too good. But all things considered, all jokes aside, I think that anyone looking at Grand Archive and knowing the schedule of products that they had kind of leading up into this felt inevitable. Like, there's no doubt in my mind that this was happening from like week 1 of getting into Grand Archive. And then also one of the devs in the Discord had also mentioned that they didn't like where prices were at. I forget if it was exactly they said prices or that people couldn't as easily find the cards that they were looking for. One of those sides of the same coin, right? But ultimately there was a statement being made about, accessibility is not quite great. And a lot of times when we think about this, it's from the sake of, it's just flat out of print, right? They're not thinking about individual cards and maybe individual cards getting too high in price or, whatever the case might be. It's really just like, hey, we got to do a reprint set. This is so common. It happens all the time in the TCG industry. And you often either do a just flat reprint, and that can be great too. And that's its own issue. To be fair, we still have to talk about Alchemical Revolution or Mercurial Heart, how they're both out of stock. No kind of second reprint yet, and this statement we'll get into it in just a moment, but something to kind of keep in mind. There's still a couple loose ends out there that we want to get a little bit of a clarification to, and there is a little bit of a con, that I have to say, or a little bit of something that's not as good in this statement that I have to highlight, because as you guys know, I do try my absolute best to both comment on the positive and some of the negatives of any types of news announcement that we get like this, but it is overwhelmingly positive. I do want to stress that up front before I get hammered about it in the comments, because I'm sure someone is going to. So let's get into this and let's just kind of read it right for it is. Then I'll kind of give my thoughts and impressions overall at the end. So, dear Grand Archive community, we acknowledge the price of Grand Archive cards has increased and, as a result, has impacted overall accessibility to the game. This is particularly true with cards from older sets which have not been readily available through our distributors. As Grand Archive continues to grow, each new set release can drive up the demand for older cards that complement new strategies. Unfortunately, this coincides with the largest influx of new players we have ever seen, creating additional challenges. Small disclaimer, absolutely, recollection decks playing a huge role in this, and I'm sure whenever the next recollection deck happens, you are going to see another large influx of players. We are committed to ensuring the competitive Grand Archive remains accessible. To address these issues, we are enhancing our product capabilities to produce new sets while also releasing reprint waves of older products. Huge win. This process will take some time, and we deeply appreciate the community's patience as we work on making reprints available. Transparency, love to see it. In the meantime, we've designed Mortal Ambition to be more beginner-friendly. This set will serve as an excellent entry point for both stores and new players. It will include several reprints, such as Dungeon Guide, which should improve game accessibility in the near future. Thank you for understanding. This really was the short, right? So overall, we know that the price of dungeon guides, and I think someone was like flooding TCG Player in light of the news, so the price might have come down a little bit, but it was very quickly getting to $40. And there were other ways, of course, to get the dungeon guides in a separate product or what have you, but ultimately, TCG Player still remains the face of like what is the card game economy, as well as card market if you are in Europe, which doesn't have Grand Archive yet, but will have it very soon. So as I kind of mentioned up front, they do make note here of reprint waves of older products. So I would 100% bet that we are going to see things like Alchemical and Mercurial Heart eventually. I think that will definitely take longer, but this Dungeon Guide reprint is absolutely the biggest thing. However, and now I have to mention my small negative because it's only fair to also think about this from the lens of where does the card pool sit overall? It is beyond any doubt, by any stretch of the imagination, as just one example, Water has really failed to define itself as a standalone element in terms of having multiple complete packages that do well and perform well in events. What I mean by that is if you look at our Chemical Revolution meta breakdown, which I did, spend, what was it, 264 decks I looked at, I forgot what the total number was, but in short, yes, Water had a single deck that did have the largest representation overall, but it was a single core identity of Water allies and does not even play into some of the other sub-themes of the element. So by design and by comparison, Water is a bit lacking and underperforming compared to Fire and Wind, which have a more robust and complete design philosophy, kind of alive and doing very, very well. Now, the downside of what this could mean, I'm not saying that it does, but one thing that kind of caught my gut immediately is the notion that this will be more beginner friendly. Now, if we are spending a 200, I think it's a 228 card set, and we have, 10 to 15 reprints, that's probably fine. If we end up having something like 40 reprints, well, that's naturally going to have an impact on pushing the game forward from a card pool standpoint and maybe limiting what Water can really gain from the new set, on top of the fact that we are supposed to get the final advanced element in that set. Now, to be fair, if you've been playing trading card games long enough, you know quite well that unless something is horribly broken or kind of stands above the rest, anytime one new theme or one new identity is introduced into a game, it doesn't really do that great at first glance, right? It usually takes 2 or 3 sets to really come into its own, be it from it was just missing 1 or 2 pieces, it just needed a key card that it got later, whatever the case might be. This is something that we see time and time again. So for me, while again, all of it, this is 99% positive and not bad in any way. I want to make sure I'm absolutely clear about that. But I do have to wonder what this is going to look like from a design standpoint, and what does this mean for future kind of deck building considerations that we make for Water, or maybe like Water gets a huge buff and then Wind is left off, right? Whatever the case might be, I do strongly feel that Wind and Fire are going to come out very far ahead in this set from a overall representation standpoint and as well as diversity standpoint, where Water is going to fall a little bit flat. And that is a fairly good segue to kind of get into this other point here before I get into my own Swiss experience, is talking about the overall meta. So I didn't want to do a full, top 8 breakdown and do this video. So it's going to be a longer video. I'm sorry. I'm super backlogged on other videos and other things I want to be doing just because of, well, everything that happened in June, if you know, you know. So trying to do my best to kind of get this all in one place and just kind of give my next thoughts before I can try to go on and either do the next Grand Archive video or other videos I have to do. So Michigan top 8, this looks completely different than what we saw kind of leading up to it. And quite honestly, this was a massive, massive surprise knowing what we saw from the last couple events, right? Water now having a really nice representation, and somehow I was the only Fire deck, whatever, I guess, but, Fire almost getting completely squeezed out of there of the top 8 report. Now, there was some draw, obviously this happens in all TCGs, but there was some draw shenanigans, and because the number of players versus what the cutoff for the number of rounds were, there was a lot of 4-2 kind of craziness that was going on. The breakers could have rolled any which way, and I didn't admittedly have time to kind of look at what the rest of top 16, or I think it was top 14 was 4-2, what those breakers would have looked like, right? Like, oh, what if they would have lost like one round later, right? So there's definitely a conversation we had there. But I think from a overall key player standpoint, you know, we do see a lot of what we expect. Huge shout out to Matt, who won back-to-back regionals with Wind Robots, is kind of everyone's kind of calling it. So this is one of the two decks that we talked about in our top 8 video, where it's like, oh, you have Wind Allies, but then you have, oh, this Wind Robot package I really want to see more explored. I dropped some, you know, hints about it on Twitter, and I hinted at it in the last video. So really cool to see it happen. But I, again, do think that if you want to play two slightly different versions of, you know, having some protective aspects of the more traditional Wind Allies versus having this like really strong combo potential, you know, stealth for 9 damage, restand, swing for 9 again, or I guess it's 7, I can't math. But anyways, like, you just do an amazing amount of damage in one turn, but be extremely vulnerable to a keycard reprogram, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It's very interesting to see how this meta might shape up and where each one of these decks will go. So I will spend a little bit more time, again, just reflecting on my Swiss round experience, but overall, this does look a lot better, and I did learn a lot from this event from an overall, you know, kind of meta-analysis standpoint. However, I will again mention that was good and bad, but we'll save that for when we get into the actual kind of breakdown of it itself. But again, huge respect to the Nico players, because as I tweeted out, I was like, man, I still love this list. I still think it's tier 2. In my opinion, you still have to like super high roll off the Icebound Slams, because your Icebound Slams games are night and day difference in terms of how you like set up and how you get to progress throughout the game. But it's just such a fun style of Guardian to play. It really reminds me of like the heavy hitting Guardians from Flesh and Blood that can really put your opponent on the back foot of going, wow, I just took 7 damage. I have to level up. I have to maybe think about more defensive plays, because if they hit me with another one of these haymakers, I'm going to be out of here, right? So again, huge shout out to everyone that came out. Huge shout out to True Champion Gaming for hosting it. Upkeep Ann Arbor for being my home store. Love them. Come join us sometime if you're in Michigan. Play some games. But with that out of the way, let's actually talk about the event itself. So I did actually have the notes up on my, you know, I tweeted everything out. I talked about my rounds individually, had a bit of experience with it. So I am going to, and of course, I just exited out of it. So I'm just doing this in real time again. But you know, I tweeted about it. I had everything pulled up in terms of my experiences. Oh, this is actually a really good point too to make now that I have this, and hopefully I remember in post not to put it up again. But this was the entry. So we got this really cool looking mat. I really love how it has these stitched edges around the side. We got 2 silver event packs, which can high roll and have some goodies in there. The sapphire packs, which I mentioned, are the Let's Go Gambling. I love getting a little gamba on. And then also, randomly, the Proxy Vault cards, which is such a silly thing to be like, oh, but you can just print off the proxy, like just go online, it's fine, right? But it is so nice to have just a physical card, and it's kind of like a nice little bonus. I do feel a little bad for people who maybe can't get to regionals and you're stuck using that like black and white paper. Like, you can buy these off TCG Player, but it feels so bad to spend 15 bucks for a Scepter of Lumnia when you just get them for free for going to a regionals. So maybe you have a friend who's been to a couple regionals and they can slide you a pack, right? I was super happy to get this, but to keep that in mind. So just to go through these really quick, Wind Allies. So, and Wind Allies is going to be not necessarily Matt's version of the deck, but it's the one that we can at least, I think I played both versions, because I do remember one Gildas, but I just called them both Wind Allies in the moment. But for this deck in particular, kind of the couple things that to really note here is going to be the Andronika Eternal Herald. And this is going to have that automaton tag on it, and it becomes a 3/3 that buffs something else and has vigor, which means it restands. So if your opponent wants to remove it, they're often going to be taking 3 damage themselves. And one of the other things that's really interesting to think about this game is, and maybe it's just because I've been so removed from, you know, more of like Magic-esque style games for so long, like a 2/3 is good in this game. Like, that's such a crazy thing to say. Like, there are decks that run 2/3s just as vanillas, you know, 4 sets into the game, because they're just good to play early and they're hard to remove. So now we have a 3/3, which, yes, does have the disclaimer of Imbue 3, which means as you play it, you have to reveal 3 win cards from your hand to get the effect. And if you watched my previous video where I talked more about kind of the meta and design standpoint, I absolutely love cards like this that plays into what makes Grand Archive unique. Please give us more Imbue. Please give us more like Brew for our Asana, things of that nature, right? Love to see this. Want to see more cards of this nature. Other than that, it's just like robots, good stuff. And there's not a Power Cell token, unfortunately, but effectively there is a card that is Power Cell token. You pay 1, you can give one of your robots +2, and effectively what you do is you load up a Shimmercloak Assassin, make it a, or I guess it would have been 6. I can't do math apparently today, right? It's a 6/2 that you swing with. You usually have a card that lets you restand it, which is this one. You attack with your champion, which is going to be a Lorraine in this case, restand your other guy again, and then just hit for 12 more. So basically out of nowhere, you get to like 13 your opponent. However, one of the downsides about having this very important tag on all of your cards, if we go down to my list, and again, huge shout out to whoever it was that played in the Australian regional, because I kind of like expected this card to be fine. And I'll talk about maybe more my list just after I finish this thought, but Reprogram itself is basically like, oh, you went all in on your combo? I'm sorry. Boop. It's gone. This card was absolutely insane all day long for me, because not only does it give you the opportunity to maybe protect your hasty messengers early on when you're trying to cycle through playing your Merlin deck, for example, it is just a hard removal, which then also has floating memory, which just gets you even more value. Like, this was by far, other than Resolute Stand, like the MVP of my day going into that matchup, because they're trying to just have 1 or 2 threats on board, and Reprogram can kind of really check them pretty hard. Now, one of the other things I want to mention from a, how does this kind of play out standpoint, I hate to use a lot of Magic kind of examples, but ultimately at the end of the day, that's a very core background for me. And I've learned very quickly that I was basically just playing Jund in the format, and I was losing, and I lost to burn decks or combo decks that were just more resilient. So I think kind of at a high level, that's one thing I want to acknowledge, and I'll probably kind of circle back to more at the end, is that I expected Grand Archive to be more, because based on how everyone talked about it, I really expected to be more like, oh, here's pillars of the format, and, whatever your matchup is, you just kind of focus on those, and you don't have to worry about too much other stuff. But in reality, not every deck has that kind of 50-50 spread, and instead you find yourselves like I have, and admittedly, I've just been playing these decks that have some very swingy matchups, unfortunately, which did skew my perception of the meta. But now that I've played through a regional, talked to some people, and have kind of come out on the other side of it, this really reminds me a lot more of playing Modern, like old school Modern, where you have like Jund, Jeskai Control, and Splinter Twin as like pillars of the format. And then you have a ton of tier 2 decks that can play well into those 3, but you really have to know your matchups and really plan out your sideboard to have a game against them, or you're just going to fall over and lose. And unfortunately, that's kind of how this event went, because just as a quick recap, going back to my thread here, right? Wind Allies 2-0, Wind Allies 2-0, Wind Allies 1-2. I misplayed the first game because like I just couldn't count for Merlin. And then the last one was in Soul Lori, which I failed the knowledge check game 1. And then from there, the aspect was like, oh, I just play Resolute. You can never kill me with your combo, and my fireballs deal more damage at the end. So like, unfortunately, I kind of just got lucky. Like, I've played card games enough that I know that depending on the meta that you're playing, and depending on a ton of different factors, right? Matchup, or Swiss Lotto, as we like to call it, can play a role. And unfortunately, and again, this is by no means meant to be a slight at any of my opponents. All my opponents were amazing all day long. They were great. It's just kind of the nature of the format that I personally kind of signed up for, that I saw a lot of Wind Allies in Chicago, and I was like, all right, that's probably going to be the meta because they're all coming here. What beats it, right? And my buddy Kyle, or Mono Water, we actually just always play the same decks in every TCG, it feels like. And he played the Wind version instead, but they ultimately want to kind of tackle that specific matchup in a very similar way. And then how you treat your late game against other decks does vary a little bit more. So Wind Allies, I mean, was just crazy all day long, because again, if they try to overextend, we have Flame Sweep, and then we're playing the level 2 of Lori, which then just says, This one. You know, on enter, get +2 attack, on kill, draw a card. So we make Flame Sweep attack for 5. We kill 3 things, or they have to waste one of their blink effects on a guide just to keep something on board. And we go, okay, cleared your board, draw 2 extra cards, probably draw into a Resolute anyways, because that's how my day was going. But, you know, it's very easy to kind of restabilize from there. However, one of the things that I did find out for how, like, I feel very confident at this point that I could play the Wind Allies matchup, and you are just extremely favored with this particular deck that I played. However, there is the Water Allies version, and I got cooked. And I think this is like really the moment where it all clicked for me in terms of like how I should see the meta, how I approach the meta, because this does feel exactly like Jund. And God, I'm forever haunted by my PTQ finals. But this feels like Jund into Burn, where you sit down, they get that couple early points of chip damage in, and you go, all right, cool, you flip the Scepter. I'm not going to draw my Meltdowns. That's 12 damage. That's, you know, 4 lightning bolts that you have to my face that I have next to 0 interaction for. Yes, there's Safeguard Amulet and some like minor tweaks outside the board, but it is very, very difficult to both answer your opponent's board and then have enough resources or time to also then deal with the thing that's given them the reach. So the thing I will say is that if you are playing against some of these Merlin decks and you're maybe struggling locally, that's kind of your 2 avenues, right? You can play the Wind Allies, which is much more board focused, much more going to have like, hey, let's play our, you know, our blink effects. Let's play our protection stuff. Let's, you know, interact with the board that way, where you have Water Allies. And then you also have random stuff like Fire Lorraine that says, hey, I'm just going to throw my sword at you, like, which is also effectively a burn deck against a Jund deck in the format the same. So there are like 3 or 4 different burn decks in this format where it's not just red deck wins burn. It's now burn 4 different ways, and I try to play the Jund deck. So, hey, lucky for me, I only had to play 1 burn deck, or my tournament run would have went very differently. But, you know, it's something that, like, this little card, you might not expect it, but whew, it is just absolutely a beating. And then, you know, there's other stuff like Song of Frost, which can just counter your Flame Sweep and turn off your interaction. So, you know, this would be something more like Delver, that your opponent doesn't have discard effects or doesn't have a way to kind of see what your points of interaction are and just go, all right, you got it. I guess you can just, you know, do the bad Mana Leak against me. And again, I apologize for all the Magic comparisons here, but it's just what works for me and really made me figure out what the meta actually is. And so I got these swift. I think this match was over in like 15 minutes. Like, I did misplay one turn because like I tried to force the Resolute. Well, I guess it wasn't a misplay because it's like my hand was like Resolute, double Dungeon Guide on 1, and then like or on 0 specifically, sorry, to go to level 1. That wasn't going to do anything for me. Cremation Ritual, and then another blank card, and I'm just like, what do I do? And that was after a Glimpse 5, I think. Like, yeah, sometimes you're just cooked, right? That's card games at the end of the day. But I just felt so utterly helpless going against this deck in particular. And then the other loss was to what I am still very strongly considering best deck in the format. Is give a huge shout out to my boy Ty. Shout out Legends of Runeterra. Really cool to see kind of like the lore family coming together in another card game. But this matchup just feels miserable for Merlin, right? Like, we are both trying to play late game decks, but one of us gets to turn off all interaction from our opponent, gets to get around all of our taunt effects that if we want to, and then also still has win cards that are just, God, he really, my live reaction, I didn't realize he was running 4 of these until just this moment. But my God, do I hate this card. Like, this is the bane of my existence. I personally love level 3 decks. And if you've been caught by one Stifling Trap, you've been caught by 1,000 of them, because it only takes one to figure out how bad this feels. Not even just out of Wind decks, but also coming out of the Tristan decks. And because they have so much filtering, spoiler, they're going to find it. So, and maybe in my opinion, like, I think there was, in our game 1, he used it on a DG instead of saving it for a ghost, and then he hit the second ghost anyways. I'm pretty sure you're just always supposed to save it for the ghost because like you just lose so much value that way. And Merlin ticking up by herself isn't really good enough in that matchup. So I would have saved it for that. But they were also like, if I'm not mistaken, that was like the first time that they picked up the deck and they went 5-1 with it, and or 4-1, excuse me, 4-1-1. And the only loss that they had was due to the fact that they got a game loss for a sleeve error situation, and they just crushed the rest of the tournament. So again, for me, just because of how many answers you have in Wind overall, I still think this is one of the best decks, if not the best deck of the format, but does require an extremely skilled pilot while also being the most expensive deck in the format. When you kind of put those two characters together, I would actually say I'm kind of surprised at how much Tristan has been topping already, but I do think that just is a way to say about how good the players are in Grand Archive, or some of the ones that have early on gravitated towards playing this deck and have been really well rewarded for it. And from there, like, again, it was just the Wind allies into those couple of bad matchups that, for me personally, like, it just wasn't a satisfying top 8, unfortunately. Like, I know it's so many people are like, oh man, you've been playing for a month, you know, you've lost so much. And I guess the other thing is I should have probably brought up my Omni, that it has been exactly a month, but you know, it doesn't feel just as good as getting a top 8 as maybe some other games have, because so much of it was just like, once I figured out the matchup, like especially the Ensoul Lori game, like I felt so bad that like I let him, you know, he got me game 1. Again, I failed the knowledge check. I put my, I tried to save my stalwart defender, which was also just dumb looking back, all things considered. But then once I just realized how good Resolute Stand was, I just couldn't lose. Like, Merlin is a super consistent deck, all things considered, when you have the 4 Creative Shock, 4 Hasty, 4 Cremation Rituals. I ran 3 because I just didn't know what other card to cut. That you're going to see your pieces. Like, it's just going to happen. So I think, like, I felt extra bad game 3 because I did see all 4 Resolutes super early. So it's just like every time you try to go for the combo, I'm like, just nope, take no damage this turn. And, you know, being able to fog your opponent just feels so incredibly good. So all of that kind of out of the way, and maybe I should have talked about this kind of up front, was, hey, what did I play and you know, why did I play it, sort of thing. Just kind of have it, some high level thoughts all in one area. You'll notice that I was using the sword for the top 8, which is this guy, the Prismatic Edge. And this has got to be one of my favorite things, is just like a value engine enabler. So with Prismatic Edge, you have a card called Ascension that for just 1, you can swap out one of your swords, bring out Prismatic Edge, both people reveal their memory, and most of the time what happens is that you're just end up going to have a fire card because you are fire, so it's free 3 damage. If your opponent's playing wind or water, you get a free card that way, and you probably found one of your other pieces where you're then also getting to draw a card. But if you get all 3 of these effects and you get to live the dream of Prismatic Edge, and I'll get the Ascension card really quick. You know, Spirit Blade Ascension, where it costs 1, but now you're drawing a card each time because of the prismatic effect, into Cruxite to pay 2, get the Spirit Blade Ascension back, draw a card from Cruxite's effect, play the Spirit Blade Ascension again to get back Prismatic Edge, and then also swing on top of it, can feel very, very strong. And then the other thing, because I knew that I was going into some of these aggro matchups where having those prismatic cards weren't as good against more like the low to the ground decks, I just had a Devastating Blow in my sideboard to swap out for those green and blue cards, because you can't play them otherwise. You know, you can discard them, sure, but I wanted playable cards. And turns out sometimes just smacking your opponent for 10 damage at level 3 is pretty good and ends the game out of nowhere. So this was my like, hey, you're planning for Fireball, but I just have this big heavy sword to your face otherwise. Can feel pretty good, it turns out. But yeah, otherwise, you know, this is a list that I think people who play the game are not surprised at all to see. Again, I think it was just a very good meta call, but I am really curious to figure out what deck I might want to take to the next event to have a little bit more play with it. So the one list that I was considering is that Kyle or Mono Water played. was the wind variant, which you can see a lot of the very similar cards with like the leader and some of that Crux top end that we talked about. But then just having more of that wind package and just having answers for everything. And then you have Cell Vanguard, which can help pump up some extra damage kind of out of nowhere that you might not expect it. And again, Stifling Trap just being insane. Like, I think if there was 2 cards that like brings me back, or I guess 3 cards that I would say for people who are looking at the game and want to be rewarded for just being a very skillful player, Stifling Trap obviously just gives you so many answers to everything. Even if you're not using the class bonus, this is just very strong. Veiling Breeze is just kind of your resolute stand on drugs, because this is just until end of turn and it's all sources and it costs 1 and you have a heavy green deck, so it's always going to be for like 3 or 4, and that cuts out so much. Is just so crazy good that, you know, deck building does limit you a little bit because you have to be so green heavy or wind heavy, but that's totally fine. And then Fairy Whispers. Ty got 4 of these by turn 2 or 3 in our matchup, and to be fair, Grand Archive is a game where like you generally lose on turn 4. Like you might not be actually dead or not, like, but you probably are far enough behind where it doesn't matter. He Fairy Whispered early on, and I'm just like, doesn't matter. It does not matter what I do the rest of this game, because he got to filter through so much and replace a card and just have perfect selection. I'm cooked. That's it. I'm done. So for me personally, I think of like how I would approach the game, and for, you know, those that are maybe kind of on the fence about Grand Archive, is don't have the experience that I did. Please, if nothing, you get nothing else out of this video, and I know this might sound crazy because I just top 8'd with it, do not build this deck. Do not build this deck. Do not build Rye. Do something with Wind. And please understand that I am being very direct and talking about what I would consider, you know, tier 1 decks, because I do want that to kind of be the main focus and kind of starting point. And then that if you were to ask me what the tier 1 decks, or to go back to the earlier point, or what are the absolute meta staples that you have to respect right now and be aware of, it's going to be Wind Allies. You know, the Gildas or robot version, whichever percentage points you want to lean, be my guess. I'm going to count them as 1 for now for the sake of this discussion. Wind Tristan, so strong, so much filtering, so much negating, so much uninteractable combo. It's just very, very good. Slimes, not only is it a fan favorite, Storm Slime is incredibly cracked right now for how good it can end up being. And then for your 4th pick, it's got to be something else that's going to be, you know, I know some people are going to say Merlin because it's still been doing very good. I realize that it's probably still going to be the pick for a lot of people because of, as I just mentioned, it does play very well into some of those other top decks, but it does have some very swingy matchups that can feel pretty bad, but it's still very good. Like, Crux is good at the end of the day, right? So instead of maybe Merlin directly, I would say something Crux. Take with that which you will, but that is kind of like the 4 main pillars that I would kind of approach the game from. And then, as I mentioned, if you approach it from specifically Wind, I think you'll have a much better time growing with the meta and really understanding it than playing a lot of the Merlin versus Rye, because I was playing Rye and then I played a bunch of Merlins or Tony decks, which just feel like absolute free wins. Or now in this event, I played Merlin and then I got a bunch of the Wind allies. And again, not that my players were bad. This is by no means a diss on any of my opponents or anything like that. The matchup just felt so insanely skewed that once I identified where some of those kind of key points were, I didn't really have to worry about the rest of the matchup. So that is definitely something to consider. I know that there are going to be a bunch of other decks out there. I am currently working on a Wind Tony and a Wind Arasana list because I think they have some interesting stuff that lines up pretty well into this meta. But those are ultimately going to be something that kind of falls into the tier 2 category, which again is playable. But I think if someone wants to approach this game from a little bit better of a spot and understand where some of those percentage points might change in each one of the matchups, instead of having such heavily one-sided matchups that I had for like a month straight, please do me a favor and start with the Wind deck, or at least start with like a variation of Slimes, because I think that they have some really interesting points of interaction that are fun to learn with, as well as being a pretty cheap deck to build into, right? Buy the Sylvie decks off of TCG Player, get 4 dungeon guides, maybe wait for the reprint. I'll leave that one up to you. and you're good to go, right? It's definitely something that is very cheap and accessible to get into the game with, while still having a number of lines that you can take and approach the game from by being able to interact with your opponent and then still having some good ways to close out the game. So, whew, longer video, lots to talk about. Like I said, I didn't really want to split this up into a couple. A lot of things have been insane in my personal life. Again, I apologize that the upload consistency hasn't been there. I wanted to formulate this out and kind of get some notes together, but it would have taken like till next week to really dig into it. And I just wanted to talk about some of these at a high level in terms of, you know, the tech that I had, you know, what were some key cards, what are the matchups I made, and kind of looking forward to the next event. So with that said, I will be going to London, hopefully, for the next regional. Honestly, I'm probably going to play water because I owe it to me as a water main to play a damn water deck in one of these events, and I think it's about time. But I'm really curious to see how this continues to shake up. Again, going back to this view of the meta, which looks quite a bit different than what we saw leading up to this. And of course, this is something to be said about having a local meta and really just like the surrounding states that come together that are going to create pocket metas across the globe, but still something to consider when you're trying to get into the game and approach it. So again, huge shout out to True Champion Gaming for running an amazing event. Huge shout out to Weebs of the Shore for finally, I shouldn't say finally, but for confirming that we are going to see a Dungeon Guide reprint in AMB, and finally seeing the reprints. That's where I was going with that. The two trains of thought got smushed together because the reprints for Alchemical are going to be really important, with like Carter and some other cards being kind of higher up there. And obviously Mercurial sold out super fast, super good set. And then with Mortal Ambition, I think is going to be a wonderful starting point for people to jump into the game with. So the last thing I got to mention, because so many people have said it, wow, you topped 8. You must absolutely love Grand Archive. It's your favorite game now. No, and that's okay. It is a good game. It doesn't have to be the greatest game of all time. It is a good game, and I think it is worth checking out. And it's totally okay if you play just Grand Archive or if you play multiple trading card games. Again, I do have a huge amount of respect for Weebs of the Shore and how they've been approaching this game and growing this game, that I think it is definitely one worth checking out. Or I wouldn't have done 30 hours making the Alchemical Revolution video and then talking about this one for 45 minutes here towards the end. So, of course, there's so many great games out there. Please check with your local game store first. That is, in my opinion, the most important thing at the end of the day with how insanely flooded this market is. And one of the main reasons, honestly, that I'm going to keep continuing to play this game in particular is because my locals is insane. And obviously, I had to play somewhat decently well to still get top 8. But having such a strong, supportive local community that is just top-notch players, it kind of got that competitive spark in me again, which I haven't felt in many years. So you might see me at more events in the future, or I might just stay local. We'll see. But again, have much more respect and understanding for the meta overall, and very curious to see where it goes from here. So with that, my friends, hope to see you at a future event. But until then, stay safe, stay hydrated, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.